Look at which hand is holding your phone right now. If it is the left one, you are part of a group that makes up somewhere around 1 person in 10, and has made up around 1 person in 10 for as long as there have been people to count. That number is the strange thing. Not the hand, the number. Because left-handedness costs you. The world is built for the other side. The scissors, the tin openers, the desks with the writing arm on the wrong flank, the guitars, the spiral notebooks that dig into the wrist, the ladles that pour away from you, the cash machines with the card slot on the right. And in population data, left-handedness sits at slightly raised rates alongside several conditions of brain development. A trait that carries costs and stays rare is a trait that evolution should have quietly deleted a very long time ago. It did not. It has been sitting at about 1 in 10 since the Stone Age, and nobody could say why. In 2024, a team in the Netherlands went looking in the DNA of 351,000 people for the answer. They found something. It is not the thing the internet promised you, and it is a good deal stranger. Start with how old this is, because the age of it is what makes it a puzzle rather than a curiosity. Prehistoric painted caves across Europe and Indonesia are covered in hand stencils, made by placing a hand flat on the rock and blowing pigment over it through a tube. The hand you see on the wall is the hand that was held still, which means the hand doing the work was the other one. Count the stencils and you get a right-handed majority in roughly the proportion you would get from a modern office. You get the same answer from several other directions at once. Stone tools struck by a right-handed napper leave a different flake pattern from those struck by a left-hander, and the ratio in the archaeological record holds. Neanderthal arm bones show heavier loading on one side, consistently the same side. Even the scratch marks on ancient front teeth point the same way, because people gripped hide in their teeth and cut it with a flint blade, and the blade slipped and caught the enamel at an angle that tells you which hand held it. 10,000 years and more. Every continent. Every culture, including the very many that tried to stamp it out. That part is worth sitting with, because the effort was enormous. Children in European schools well into the 1960s had the left hand tied behind the chair, or strapped, or simply hit with a ruler until they changed. The same happened across much of the Middle East, India, Japan, and China, in some places on hygiene grounds, and in others on straightforwardly moral ones, and the language carries the fingerprints of it. The Latin for left is sinister, which arrived in English meaning exactly what you think it means. The Latin for right is dexter, which is where you get dexterity. The French for left is gauche, which English borrowed to mean socially clumsy, while adroit, to the right, became adroit, meaning skillful. The Old English word for the left hand was lift, which also meant weak, and the word we use for someone equally good with both hands is ambidextrous, which translates literally as having 2 right hands. While there is no neutral vocabulary here, 6 or 7 languages independently decided that one side of the body was competence and the other side was moral failure, and then handed those words to you to describe yourself with. The switching had one measurable effect, and it is not the one people assume. It did not reduce the number of left-handers born. It reduced the number of left-handers counted. When large surveys in the second half of the 20th century started asking people directly, the reported rate of left-handedness among those born around 1900 came out at 3 or 4%, while among those born after about 1950, it came out at 11, 12, 13%. The trait did not surge, the punishment stopped, and the number went back to what it had always been underneath. Hold on to that, because it is going to explain one of the most repeated statistics about left-handers later in this video. Now, the cost side. Left-handedness is what biologists call a costly minority trait, and the costs are not just the tin opener. There is a mild but consistent elevation in rates of left-handedness among people with certain conditions of brain development. The effect is small, it says nothing whatsoever about any individual, and the vast majority of left-handers have nothing of the kind. But at population scale it is real, and it means the trait is under some degree of negative pressure, which sets up the problem. A trait that is heritable, minority, and mildly costly should shrink towards 0 over enough generations. This one has not moved in 10,000 years, across populations that had no contact with each other. Something has been holding it in place, and for 50 years, everybody looked for that something in the genome. For most of the 20th century, researchers assumed there would be a gene for handedness, one switch with two settings, the way eye color used to be taught in school. Several elegant single-gene models were published and taught. They produced, in the end, nothing that replicated. Then came the biobanks, and the sample sizes went from hundreds to hundreds of thousands. In 2024, Shivan, Franks, and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen did something the earlier work could not afford to do. Instead of scanning common variants scattered across the genome, they read the exome, the protein coding portion, the part that actually specifies the shape of a protein, in 38,043 left-handers and 313,271 right-handers from the UK Biobank, hunting for rare mutations with large effects on the few people who carry them. One gene came out above the noise. It is called TUBB4B, and rare coding variants in it are 2.7 times more common in left-handers than in right-handers. Most of those variants are single-letter changes that swap one amino acid for another. Two of them are frame shifts, the kind of error that garbles everything downstream of it, and those two were found only in left-handers, in nobody on the right-handed side of the sample at all. Here is what that gene does, because this is the part worth actually understanding. 2B4B codes for beta-tubulin. Tubulin is the raw material of microtubules, which are the internal scaffolding of every cell in your body. The rails that haul chromosomes apart when a cell divides, and the tracks that carry cargo up and down the inside of a nerve cell that may be a meter long. Dunby pernunce. Microtubules are also what build cilia, the small beating hairs on the surface of certain cells. And cilia are how a human embryo works out which way round it is. In the third week after conception, in a structure called the node, a patch of cilia begins to rotate in a coordinated direction and pushes fluid across the embryo in one particular direction. That current is the signal that tells the developing body which side is left. It is why your heart sits where it does. It is why your liver is on the right and your spleen is not. When that machinery fails, organs end up mirrored. So the clearest genetic signal anyone has found for which hand you write with sits inside the machinery that sets the left-right axis of your whole body, weeks before you have a body worth speaking of. Which hand you favor was being decided before you had hands, by a current of fluid moving across a disk of cells about the size of a full stop. The same study picked up two more genes worth naming, DSCAM and FOXP1, both of which had shown up before in exome screens for autism and schizophrenia. That connection is genuinely there in the data, and it is genuinely tiny, and it is the sort of finding that gets rewritten by a headline writer into something it does not say. It describes a faint statistical overlap in gene pathways across hundreds of thousands of people. It describes nothing about you. While we are inside the skull, let us kill the biggest myth in the whole field. You have been told that left-handers are right-brained, and that this makes them creative, intuitive, and artistic, as against the logical, verbal, left-brained majority. Almost none of that survives contact with the actual data. Handedness and language do sit on opposite sides in most people, but the split is nothing like the folklore. In right-handers, language is processed predominantly in the left hemisphere in roughly 95% of cases. In left-handers, it is still the left hemisphere in something like 70%, a clear majority. The remainder is split between right hemisphere dominance and a genuinely bilateral arrangement, and the stronger your left-handedness, the more likely you are to be in that group. So the average left-hander has a brain organized much the way the average right-handers is. What is different is that left-handers are more variable as a group. There is more spread. That is a real and interesting finding, and it is not the same sentence as left-handers are right-brained, which is not a thing. And the creativity claim does not hold up either. Study after study looking for higher creativity, higher intelligence, or greater artistic ability in left-handers comes back with effects that are absent, tiny, or that vanish when the sample gets large. The impression persists because of small numbers used badly. 5 of the last few American presidents were left-handed, which sounds like a pattern until you notice you are drawing a conclusion from about 7 people. With a sample that small, you can find a striking pattern in almost anything. Now I want to stop and be straight with you about what the 2024 study did not find, because this is where every article you have read about it goes wrong. It did not find a left-handed gene. 2UBV4B is not a switch. The overwhelming majority of left-handers carry none of these variants. The carriers are a small minority inside a minority, and plenty of right-handers carry them and write with their right hand anyway. When the researchers calculated how much of left-handedness across the whole population is explained by all rare coding variants taken together, the answer came out at 0.91%. Less than 1% of the trait. Widen the search and it barely improves. A separate study of roughly 1.7 million people identified 41 regions of the genome associated with handedness, and every one of them has an effect so small that you could not see it in an individual if you were looking directly at it. Twin studies put the total genetic contribution at somewhere around a quarter of the variance, meaning 3/4 of it is not inherited at all. And identical twins, who share every gene they have, disagree about which hand to use often enough that you cannot predict one twin from the other. There is no test. There is no report you can order that will tell you your hand is genetically exceptional, and if somebody is selling you one, they are selling you a horoscope in a lab coat. And since we are clearing the table, you are not going to die young. In 1991, 2 psychologists published a finding that left-handers died about 9 years earlier than right-handers. It went round the world, and it is still repeated at dinner tables 35 years later. Their method was to obtain death certificates and then ask the surviving families which hand the deceased person had used for writing. Now think back to the ruler and the strap. The older the deceased, the more likely they had been forced to switch as children, and the more likely, too, that the family simply remembered them as right-handed. So the pool of people recorded as left-handed skewed young by construction. Not because left-handers were dying early, but because the people who were allowed to stay left-handed had been born later. One epidemiologist pointed out at the time that the identical reasoning would prove nursery school is more dangerous than parachute training, on the grounds that the children who die are younger than the trainees who do. Studies that followed people forwards in time, comparing within the same birth cohorts, find no survival difference at all. The 9 years never existed. A short sentence with a number in it beats a long correction with caveats in it, every single time, which is why you had heard the first one and not the second. So, no gene, no test, no early grave, which raises the obvious question of what the other 3/4 actually is. The honest answer is that a good deal of it is not environment either. Prenatal factors nudge it slightly. Birth weight, multiple births, maternal age, but all of them together account for very little. What is left over, and it is the largest single share, appears to be developmental noise, chance. The particular way a specific patch of cilia in a specific embryo happened to get organized in a specific week, in a process with enough randomness in it that the same genome run twice gives different answers. That is an unsatisfying thing to be told about yourself, and it is very probably true. A quarter inheritance, a sliver of environment, and the rest a coin landing in a body that had not finished being built. Which brings us at last to the thing that is actually real, and it has nothing to do with reading your own DNA. In 1996, a French research group proposed an explanation for why left-handedness has never disappeared, and gave it a blunt name: the fighting hypothesis. The argument runs like this. In a close one-on-one physical contest, familiarity is worth an enormous amount. A right-hander has spent his entire life competing against other right-handers, because that is overwhelmingly who is available to compete against. He has almost no practice against the mirror image. Meanwhile, a left-hander has also spent his entire life competing against right-handers, because that is who is available to him too. So when the two meet, one of them is in a fight they have had 10,000 times, and the other is in a fight they have had a handful of times. Everything the right-hander has automated is now pointing at the wrong side of the body. This is what biologists call negative frequency-dependent selection, and it makes a prediction that can be checked. The advantage should appear only where you face an opponent directly and must react to their body in real time. It should be entirely absent where you perform alone. That is precisely the pattern in the data. Left-handers are heavily overrepresented at the top of fencing, boxing, cricket, tennis, table tennis, and baseball, in some elite categories reaching several times their share of the general population, and in a few reaching something close to half. In darts, in swimming, in gymnastics, in the events where nobody is standing opposite you reacting to your geometry, they sit at the ordinary 1 in 10. For years, the fair criticism was that being overrepresented is not the same as winning. Turning up more often could reflect selection into the sport rather than success within it. Then in 2019, 2 researchers at Manchester tested it properly on more than 13,800 professional boxers and mixed martial artists across 3 samples. Left-handed fighters did not merely turn up more often, they won more, measured both as the percentage of bouts won and against an objective rating of fighting ability. It held for women as well as men. Later work has sharpened the conditions. The edge shows up most reliably in sports under high time pressure, where the response has to be produced faster than conscious thought can correct for the unfamiliar layout. Give the opponent time to think, and it fades. There is a version of this test outside sport as well. A 2005 study looked at traditional societies with different levels of interpersonal violence and reported that the proportion of left-handers was higher in the more violent ones, which is what the hypothesis predicts if actual fighting is the selection pressure. Treat that one with some care. The samples are small. Later work in other non-industrial populations has not always agreed, and this remains an argument rather than a settled fact. But the sporting evidence, at least, is about as solid as this field gets. So that is your superpower, and it is genuine. Now look closely at where it actually lives. It is not in your hand, it is not in your brain, and it is not in TUBB4B. Your reflexes are not faster. Your muscles are not arranged differently. There is no measured physical advantage anywhere in your body. Every last bit of the advantage is made out of other people's inexperience. Which means it is not a property of you at all. It is a property of the population you happen to be standing in. If left-handers became half the human race tomorrow, it would be gone by the end of the week. Every right-hander would be exactly as practiced against you as you are against them, and the edge would fall to 0. And that is the answer to the puzzle we started with, 10,000 years ago on a cave wall. Left-handedness is not rare in spite of being useful. It is useful because it is rare. Push the frequency up and the benefit falls away. Push it down and the benefit climbs. It settles at the point where the advantage in a close contest exactly balances the cost of living in a world built the other way round. That point appears to be about 1 person in 10, and it has held there across every continent and every century anyone has managed to measure, because it is not an accident and never was. It is an equilibrium. So the honest version of what DNA revealed is this. It found a gene that builds the scaffolding inside your cells and helped decide which way round your body is, weeks before you were a body. It found 41 faint signals and 1 clear rare one, and all of them together account for a small fraction of the answer. It confirmed that your handedness was settled in the womb and that the rest of it was chance. It did not find a superpower, because the superpower was never written in your genome. It was written in everybody else's. You did not choose the hand. It was chosen by a current of fluid across an embryonic disc, partly directed by genes you inherited from people who died centuries before anyone had a word for a gene. Every ruler that came down on it failed. Every language you might describe it in decided in advance that it meant weak, clumsy, unlucky, or wicked. And the one genuine advantage it has ever given you exists purely because most people are not like you, which is a very strange thing to take pride in, and I would forgive you for taking pride in it anyway. If you are left-handed, tell me the moment you first worked out that the world was not built for you. The scissors, the school desk, the tin opener, the teacher who tried to change it, and whether they succeeded. And tell me whether anyone else in your family shares it, because in roughly a quarter of cases somebody will. And if you are right-handed and you have got this far, tell me the last time you played anything at all against a left-hander and could not work out why it felt wrong. Now you know.